people whose stories you are about to hear were not criminals. They were not dangerous. They were not threatening anyone. They were going about their lives the same way you do every single day, driving home from the grocery store, walking back from a convenience store, sitting on their own couch, sleeping in their own bed. The one thing they all had in common is that they crossed paths with the people who were supposed to protect them, and that crossing cost them everything. These are not cases where the facts are disputed or unclear. These are cases with videos, autopsies, court records, federal investigations, and in some instances, criminal convictions. Cases where the evidence was laid out in full and the world still watched the people responsible walk free, or serve months instead of years, or face no consequences at all. Today we are covering 10 innocent people who were killed by police, what happened to each of them, and what the justice system decided their lives were worth. Case 1. Eric Garner. Eric Garner was a 43-year-old black man from Staten Island, New York. He was a father of 6 children. On July 17, 2014, he was killed by a New York City Police Department officer named Daniel Pantaleo on a sidewalk in the St. George neighborhood of Staten Island. He was not armed. He had not hurt anyone. He was not running away. The police approached him that day because they suspected he had been selling loose cigarettes. Single cigarettes sold outside of a pack without a tax stamp. That was it. That was the reason 5 officers surrounded a 43-year-old man on a public sidewalk in the middle of the afternoon. Not robbery, not assault, not a weapon. Loose cigarettes. What happened next was filmed by a bystander named Ramsey Orta on his phone. The video went around the world, and what it showed was so clear, so undeniable, that it sparked a national movement and became one of the most talked about cases of police brutality in American history. Eric Garner died on that sidewalk because of a chokehold that had been banned by the NYPD since 1993. The medical examiner ruled his death a homicide, and not a single officer was ever criminally charged. Eric Garner grew up in Brooklyn and later moved to Staten Island. People who knew him described him as a big man with a bigger personality. He stood around 6 feet 3 inches tall and weighed over 350 pounds. He had a warm presence and was known in his neighborhood. He had asthma and heart disease, conditions that would become deeply relevant to how he died. By 2014, Garner had a history of run-ins with police, mostly related to selling loose cigarettes on the street. He had been arrested multiple times for it. He found it humiliating. In the weeks before his death, he had told people close to him that he was tired of being stopped and harassed by the same officers over and over again for the same thing. On the day he died, he told the officers exactly that. Those words were caught on camera. The neighborhood where Garner spent time, around Bay Street in Staten Island, was an area where police regularly patrolled for low-level street offences. Officers in plain clothes and uniform both worked the area. Garner was a familiar face to many of them. He was not a stranger to police attention, and police were not strangers to him. What makes this case land so hard is not just what happened in those final minutes, but everything that came before them. A man who had lived his whole life being stopped, searched, and arrested for minor offences. A man who that day had just broken up a fight between 2 other men on the street. A man who, when the officers walked up to him, was not doing anything illegal at that exact moment, and still, within minutes, he was dead. Eric Garner was not a career criminal. He had a record, yes, but almost entirely for low-level offences, selling loose cigarettes, small drug possession charges, nothing violent, the kind of offences that in wealthier neighbourhoods rarely result in any police contact at all. He had worked as a horticulturist for the New York City Parks Department for many years. By 2014, he was no longer employed there and had struggled to find steady work. He sold loose cigarettes on the street as a way to make money. In New York, untaxed cigarettes bought in bulk from lower tax states and sold individually could turn a small profit. It was illegal, but it was not violent. It hurt nobody. His wife, Esau Garner, later described him as a devoted father who loved his children. His daughter, Erica Garner, became one of the most prominent activists in the years following his death, speaking publicly and organising protests until her own death from a heart attack in December 2017, at just 27 years old. His mother, Gwen Carr, also became a public advocate for police accountability and wrote a book about her son. In the period leading up to July 2014, Garner had made it known to friends and family that he felt he was being constantly targeted by police in his neighbourhood. He told people around him that the harassment never stopped and that he was done tolerating it. On July 17, 2014, Garner was standing outside a beauty supply store on Bay Street in Staten Island. He had reportedly just helped break up a fight nearby. When plainclothes officers approached him, the encounter began with words. Garner told them he was tired of being messed with. He said he had not been doing anything. He asked them to leave him alone. All of it was caught on Ramsey Orta's phone. All of it was calm for the first few seconds. Then Officer Daniel Pantaleo moved in to arrest him. The confrontation on Bay Street did not appear out of nowhere. It was the latest moment in a long pattern between Garner and the police officers who worked that stretch of Staten Island. Officers Justin D'Amico and Daniel Pantaleo were both familiar with Garner. D'Amico had previously arrested Garner on a charge related to selling loose cigarettes. There had also been a deeply troubling prior incident involving Pantaleo. In 2012, a black man named Darren Collins filed a lawsuit alleging that Pantaleo and another officer had strip-searched him on the street without cause. That lawsuit was settled by the city. Another lawsuit from the same year named Pantaleo in a stop-and-frisk incident. These complaints existed before Garner ever died. On the day of the killing, the officers approached Garner because someone had allegedly called about the loose cigarette sales. When the officers arrived, Garner told them he was not selling anything at that moment. He was frustrated. He raised his voice. But he did not threaten anyone. He did not make a move toward the officers. He put his hands up in a gesture of exasperation and said he was tired of being harassed. There were multiple officers present. Garner was standing on a sidewalk, frustrated, talking. He was not reaching for anything. He was not running. He was a large man, yes, but he was simply standing there, expressing that he did not want to be arrested again for something he maintained he was not doing. When Pantaleo moved in to grab him, Garner pulled his arms away and said, "Do not touch me." That was the moment Pantaleo wrapped his arm around Garner's neck from behind. The chokehold. The move the NYPD had banned from use by its officers 21 years earlier. At approximately 3:30 in the afternoon, in full daylight, on a public sidewalk, Daniel Pantaleo put his arm around Eric Garner's neck and pulled him backward. Garner went down. Several officers moved in to pin him to the ground. Pantaleo used his hands to push Garner's face into the sidewalk while pressing down on him. At least 3 other officers helped hold him down. Garner was on his stomach, face pressed against the concrete, multiple grown men on top of him. He said the words, "I can't breathe," 11 times. 11. Each time his voice got weaker, he lost consciousness. The officers around him did not call for emergency medical help right away. The NYPD sergeant who supervised the arrest, Kizzy Adonis, was standing right there. She did not intervene. She did not stop the chokehold. She did not call for immediate medical assistance as Garner went limp. Emergency medical technicians arrived at the scene around 7 minutes after Garner lost consciousness. He was still alive at that point, but unresponsive. He was placed on a gurney. EMTs did not perform CPR on the way to the hospital. About an hour after the encounter began, Eric Garner was pronounced dead at Richmond University Medical Center. The New York City medical examiner conducted an autopsy and reviewed the video footage. The cause of death was ruled homicide. The specific cause, compression of the neck from the chokehold, compression of the chest from being held face down on the ground, and his pre-existing conditions including asthma and heart disease. The chokehold was the initiating act. It started a chain of events that killed him. Eric Garner's death immediately went public because the video did. Ramsey Orta uploaded the footage and it spread across the internet within days. The NYPD placed the involved officers on desk duty while an investigation was opened. The Staten Island grand jury convened in the fall of 2014 to decide whether to bring criminal charges against Daniel Pantaleo. On December 3, 2014, the grand jury announced it would not indict Pantaleo on any charge. Not manslaughter, not reckless endangerment, nothing. Protests broke out in New York City and in cities across the United States. The words "I can't breathe" appeared on protest signs everywhere. NBA players wore warm-up shirts with the phrase printed on them. Federal prosecutors then opened their own civil rights investigation. That investigation lasted 5 years. In 2019, the United States Department of Justice announced it would not bring federal charges either, citing the high legal standard required to prove that an officer acted willfully to violate someone's rights. The NYPD's own disciplinary process was the only remaining path to any consequence. In 2019, an NYPD disciplinary judge recommended that Pantaleo be fired. Police Commissioner James O'Neill accepted that recommendation. In August 2019, 5 years after Garner's death, Pantaleo was fired from the New York City Police Department. No criminal conviction, no jail time, just the loss of his job, 5 years later. There was no criminal trial in this case. The Staten Island grand jury decided in December 2014 that there was not enough evidence to bring Pantaleo to trial on any criminal charge. That meant the entire question of whether what he did was a crime was never argued in front of a jury. The federal investigation ran from 2014 to 2019. In July 2019, federal prosecutors recommended bringing charges against Pantaleo. The decision went up to Attorney General William Barr, who declined to authorize the prosecution. The DOJ's official statement explained that to convict under the relevant federal law, prosecutors would need to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the officer acted willfully. Not negligently, not recklessly, willfully. They said the evidence did not meet that standard. The only formal proceeding that resulted in any finding against Pantaleo was the NYPD departmental trial. Deputy Commissioner Rosemarie Maldonado found that Pantaleo had used a chokehold in violation of department rules and recommended his termination. Pantaleo then sued to get his job back. A court sided with the NYPD and upheld the firing. Because no criminal trial ever took place, there was no sentencing. The only formal consequence Pantaleo ever faced was the loss of his job, which came 5 years after the day he killed Eric Garner. Esau Garner said the settlement money meant nothing compared to losing her husband. She described the grand jury decision as a punch in the face. Gwen Carr became one of the most recognized faces of the movement for police accountability in America. She traveled the country, testified before Congress, and wrote a book called This Stops Today. She has said she still does not understand how a man could be killed on video, with the whole world watching, and no one could be held criminally responsible. Erica Garner, Eric's daughter, spent the years after his death organizing and fighting for justice. She died in December 2017 from a heart attack. She was 27 years old. She had a newborn son at the time of her death. The city of New York eventually banned chokeholds by law in 2020 in legislation named Eric Garner's Law. That law passed 6 years after he died. Daniel Pantaleo was fired from the NYPD in August 2019. He has not faced any criminal charges. He has not served a single day in jail. The chokehold that killed Eric Garner was banned by the NYPD in 1993. It was illegal under department rules on the day Pantaleo used it. The medical examiner called the death a homicide. The video showed everything. And still, the criminal justice system at every level found a reason not to prosecute. Gwen Carr was in the room in 2020 when Eric Garner's Anti-Chokehold Act was signed into law in New York. She described that moment as bittersweet, a law named after her son who should still be alive. The words Eric Garner said in his final moments became a rallying cry heard around the world, repeated again 6 years later as another man named George Floyd said the exact same words under the knee of another police officer in Minneapolis. 2 men, 2 different cities, 6 years apart, the same last words. While Eric Garner's case lit the match, the next case shows what happens when a child armed with nothing more than a toy gun is dead within 2 seconds of police arriving on the scene, and the officer who pulled the trigger had already been declared emotionally unfit for duty by a previous police department before he was ever handed a badge in Cleveland. Case 2. Tamir Rice. Tamir Elijah Rice was 12 years old. He was in 6th grade at Marion Seltzer Elementary School in Cleveland, Ohio. He liked to draw, play basketball, and perform in his school's drumline. His mother, Samaria Rice, described him as the glue that held the family together. He was her youngest child. On November 22, 2014, Tamir was shot and killed by a Cleveland police officer named Timothy Lohman in a park next to the Kudell Recreation Center, a place he went to regularly. He was playing with a toy gun, an airsoft pellet gun that shot plastic pellets. The orange safety tip that would have identified it as a toy had been removed, but Tamir was 12 years old, and he was playing alone in a park on a Saturday afternoon. He was shot within 2 seconds of the police car stopping next to him. He never had a chance to say a word. Tamir died the following day at Metro Health Medical Center. He was 12 years old. The officer who shot him, Timothy Lohman, had previously been declared emotionally unstable and unfit for duty by another police department. That information was sitting in a personnel file that the Cleveland Division of Police never bothered to read before hiring him. No criminal charges were ever filed against Lohman. The city of Cleveland initially responded to the lawsuit filed by Tamir's family by suggesting that Tamir himself was responsible for his own death. That response caused its own national outrage. Tamir Rice was born on June 25, 2002, in Cleveland, Ohio. He was the youngest of 4 children born to Samaria Rice and Leonard Warner. His mother described him as affectionate, loving, helpful, and funny. He still played with trucks and Legos and watched cartoons. He was a kid, a regular 12-year-old kid who happened to be big for his age, standing around 5 feet 7 inches tall and weighing 195 pounds. That size would later be used to try to justify what happened to him, which tells you something about how the case was handled from the very beginning. He attended school in Cleveland and was known by teachers and classmates as a pleasant, easygoing boy. He had a large extended family and a tight group of friends. His mother had moved the family from Denver to Cleveland specifically to get away from gang violence and give her children a safer environment. The park next to the Kudell Recreation Center, where Tamir spent time regularly, was in their neighborhood. It was a familiar place. The day he died, Tamir went to the park alone. He had an airsoft pellet gun with him. At some point that afternoon, he was seen near a gazebo in the park, pointing the gun around and waving it. A 17-year-old at the park called 911 to report it. The caller told the dispatcher twice that the gun was probably fake and that the person holding it was probably a juvenile. He said it clearly, probably fake, probably a juvenile. The dispatcher who received that call did not pass either of those details on to the officers who were sent to the scene. Officers Timothy Lohman and Frank Garmbach were told there was a male with a gun pointing it at people. That was all they were told. No mention that the gun might be a toy. No mention that the person might be a child. That failure by the dispatcher had consequences nobody could undo. The dispatcher was later suspended for 8 days. Timothy Lohman was 26 years old at the time of the shooting. He had been a Cleveland police officer for just 8 months. Before joining the Cleveland Division of Police, he had worked briefly for the Independence Police Department, a suburb of Cleveland. His time there lasted less than a year. When he left, his supervisor wrote a letter describing him as emotionally immature, stating that he had a dangerous loss of composure during firearms training and recommending that he be released from employment. The letter was placed in his personnel file. When Lohman applied to the Cleveland Division of Police, he did not disclose this information on his application. The Cleveland Division of Police did not request or review his previous personnel file before hiring him. They gave a man who had already been declared unfit to carry a gun, another gun, and put him in a patrol car. Frank Garmbach, the officer who was driving the patrol car, was 46 years old and had been with the Cleveland force since 2008. He was Lohman's senior partner that day. On the afternoon of November 22, 2014, the 2 officers were dispatched to the Kudell Recreation Center area in response to the 911 call. Garmbach drove the patrol car across the grass of the park and pulled it up directly next to the gazebo where Tamir was standing. There was no slow approach, no attempt to assess the situation from a distance. The car pulled up fast and stopped within a few feet of the 12-year-old boy. Surveillance footage from a camera at the recreation center captured what happened next. The footage had no audio. Lohman opened the passenger door and stepped out of the car. Within 2 seconds of the car stopping, he fired 2 shots at Tamir. One bullet struck Tamir in the torso. He fell to the ground immediately. 2 seconds. The officers did not render first aid. Tamir lay on the ground next to the gazebo. 4 minutes passed before another Cleveland police officer arrived and began administering aid. An FBI agent who happened to be nearby also helped. Emergency medical services arrived 3 minutes after that. By then, Tamir had been lying on the ground for roughly 7 minutes without medical attention from the officers who shot him. At the same time that Tamir was on the ground, his 14-year-old sister came running toward him. She had been nearby and heard the shots. Officers tackled her to the ground and handcuffed her, then placed her in the back of the patrol car, where she could see her dying brother through the window. Her mother arrived shortly after and was also prevented from getting to Tamir, with officers telling her to calm down or she would be arrested. Tamir was taken to Metro Health Medical Center. He died the following day, November 23, 2014. The medical examiner ruled his death a homicide. The cause of death was a gunshot wound to the torso, with injuries to major vessels, intestines, and pelvis. The airsoft pellet gun he had been holding was recovered at the scene. It was found next to the gazebo. It had never been on his body when he was shot. The shooting was captured on the surveillance footage, which the Cleveland police released to the public several days later. The video was grainy and had no audio, but it clearly showed how quickly everything happened. A car pulling up, a door opening, a child falling. A municipal court judge named Ronald Adrien reviewed the case in June 2015 at the request of community members who wanted the officers charged. After reviewing the evidence, he wrote that he was thunderstruck by how quickly this event turned deadly. He found probable cause to charge Lohman with murder and Garmbach with negligent homicide and dereliction of duty. His findings were sent to the Cuyahoga County prosecutor. The county prosecutor, Timothy McGinty, did not act on those findings. Instead, he convened a grand jury. Before the grand jury heard the case, McGinty released 2 expert reports that he had commissioned. Both reports concluded the shooting was reasonable. McGinty presented those reports publicly before the grand jury had even finished deliberating, a move that was widely criticized as an attempt to shape the outcome. On December 28, 2015, the grand jury declined to indict either officer. The announcement came 13 months after Tamir died. There would be no criminal trial, no charges, nothing. There was no criminal trial. There was no courtroom. There was no prosecutor standing up and arguing that a 12-year-old boy deserved justice. The grand jury process ended in December 2015 with no indictment, and that was the conclusion of the criminal proceedings. The Department of Justice opened its own federal investigation into the case. That investigation ran for years. On December 29, 2020, the DOJ announced it was closing the investigation without charges. The official statement acknowledged that Tamir's death was tragic, but said the evidence was insufficient to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the officers had willfully violated his civil rights. Lohman was never criminally charged for the shooting itself. He was eventually fired from the Cleveland Division of Police in May 2017, but not for shooting Tamir. He was fired for lying on his job application by failing to disclose the circumstances of his departure from the Independence Police Department. Garmbach received a written reprimand for his driving tactics that day, specifically for pulling the car so close to Tamir instead of stopping at a safer distance. That was the extent of his discipline. He remained employed as a patrol officer with the Cleveland Division of Police. The city of Cleveland did not accept responsibility for what happened. In a legal filing responding to the wrongful death lawsuit brought by Tamir's family, the city initially argued that Tamir's injuries and death were caused by his own actions. That filing was made public and drew widespread condemnation. The city later walked it back. In April 2016, the city of Cleveland agreed to pay Tamir Rice's family $6 million to settle the civil rights lawsuit. The settlement was broken down as $5.5 million to Tamir's estate, $250,000 to his mother Samaria, and $250,000 to his sister. The city did not admit any wrongdoing. Samaria Rice, Tamir's mother, has said publicly that she felt abandoned by the justice system at every level. She spent years pushing for the case to be reopened, for Lohman to face charges, for some form of accountability. In a 2024 interview on the 10th anniversary of her son's death, she said she still feels like she is living in a nightmare she cannot wake up from. Lohman was not done making headlines after Cleveland fired him. In 2021, he was briefly hired as the sole police officer in Tioga, a small borough in Pennsylvania. He withdrew his application shortly after being sworn in, when news of his hiring caused public backlash. In 2024, he was hired by a police department in West Virginia. He resigned from that position quickly as well, again due to public outrage. As of 2026, Timothy Lohman has never served a day in jail or faced a criminal conviction for the shooting of Tamir Rice. Frank Garmbach still works as a patrol officer in Cleveland. The dispatcher who failed to pass on the critical details from the 911 caller received an 8-day suspension and returned to work. In Cleveland, a memorial garden named the Tamir Rice Afrocentric Cultural Center was opened on St. Clair Avenue in 2022, near the site of the shooting. It stands as a permanent marker of what was lost. Samaria Rice has continued to advocate publicly for her son's memory and for changes to how police engage with children. Tamir Rice was 12 years old. He was playing in a park. He was dead within 2 seconds of the police arriving. The officer who killed him should never have been given a badge, and not one person was ever held criminally responsible. __quote _1__. While Tamir Rice was killed in broad daylight in a public park, the next case takes place inside a moving car during a routine traffic stop, where a man who did everything right, who told the officer exactly what the law required him to say, was shot 5 times anyway, while his girlfriend and her 4-year-old daughter watched from the passenger seat. Case 3. Philando Castile. Philando Castile was 32 years old. He worked as a nutrition supervisor at J.J. Hill Montessori Magnet School in St. Paul, Minnesota. The kids there called him Mr. Phil. He knew the names of hundreds of students and remembered which ones had food allergies. He had worked in school cafeterias for years and was described by staff and students as one of the warmest people in the building. On the evening of July 6, 2016, Philando was driving home from a grocery store in Falcon Heights, a suburb of St. Paul. His girlfriend, Diamond Reynolds, was in the passenger seat. Her 4-year-old daughter was in the back seat. It was a Wednesday evening. They had just gone shopping. A St. Anthony police officer named Geronimo Yanez pulled them over. Philando told Yanez he had a licensed firearm in the car. He was legally carrying it. He did everything the law required him to do. Within seconds of that disclosure, Yanez fired 7 shots into the car at close range. 5 of them hit Philando. Diamond Reynolds pulled out her phone and began live streaming on Facebook. The video that followed was watched by millions of people within hours. It showed Philando slumped in the driver's seat, blood spreading across his shirt, while Reynolds narrated what had just happened in a voice that was somehow both terrified and unnervingly calm. Her 4-year-old daughter was in the back seat through all of it. Philando Castile died that night. Geronimo Yanez was charged with second-degree manslaughter. A jury acquitted him of all charges. He was fired by the St. Anthony Police Department the same day the verdict came in. Philando Castile was born on July 16, 1983, in St. Paul, Minnesota. He grew up in the city and attended St. Paul Central High School. After school, he went to work in food service and eventually built a career in school nutrition. By 2016, he had been working in the St. Paul Public School District for over a decade across multiple cafeteria positions. He was known throughout the school community as someone who genuinely cared. He memorized student names, he remembered dietary restrictions, he made sure kids who could not afford lunch got fed without embarrassment. One of his supervisors described him as the kind of employee you cannot replace. Outside of work, Philando was described by family and friends as gentle, funny, and devoted to the people around him. He and Diamond Reynolds had been together for a while. Reynolds had a daughter, Diana, who was 4 years old in the summer of 2016. Philando was a steady presence in both their lives. He had a valid permit to carry a firearm in Minnesota. He had no violent criminal history. He had been pulled over by police many times before, a fact that only became widely known after his death, when records showed he had been stopped 49 times in the preceding 13 years, mostly for minor traffic infractions. He had received 86 violations from those stops, fines he often could not fully pay. But he had never been convicted of a violent offence. He was not a threat to anyone. On the evening of July 6, 2016, Philando, Diamond and Diana drove to a grocery store and then headed home. The route took them through Falcon Heights, a small suburb sitting between St. Paul and Minneapolis. It was around 9 in the evening. Officer Geronimo Yanez and his partner, Officer Joseph Causa, were on patrol in the area. Yanez later testified that he had pulled Philando over because he thought Philando matched the description of a suspect in an armed robbery that had taken place nearby several days earlier. The reason he gave was a wide nose and the fact that Philando was black. That was his justification for the stop. Philando had not committed any traffic violation that prompted the pullover, though Yanez also noted a broken brake light. The stop began as thousands of traffic stops do. Yanez approached the driver's side window. Philando handed over his insurance card. The interaction was calm. Then Philando told Yanez he needed to let him know he had a firearm on him. He said it clearly and calmly. He told the officer he was licensed to carry. Yanez said, "Do not reach for it then." Philando said he was not reaching for it. He said he was reaching for his wallet and his identification because that is what Yanez had asked for. The exchange was brief. Yanez told him twice more not to pull out the weapon. Philando said he was not pulling it out. Yanez then fired 7 shots through the driver's side window at close range. The sound of the shots is audible in the video Diamond Reynolds began recording almost immediately after. The video starts with Philando already shot, his body slumping, blood visible on his shirt and arm. Yanez can be heard after the shots screaming, his voice cracking. Reynolds, somehow composed, narrates what has just happened to the camera. She tells the audience Philando was reaching for his wallet. She says the officer shot him for no reason. Diana, 4 years old, is in the back seat. She would later tell her mother from the back of a police car, "It is okay, Mommy, I am right here with you." Philando Castile was shot 5 times. He was taken from the car by officers and paramedics and transported to Hennepin County Medical Center. He was pronounced dead at 9:37 that evening. He was 32 years old. He had been planning to enroll at Ivy Tech Community College in the fall. He and Diamond had talked about their future together. Diamond Reynolds live-streamed the immediate aftermath of the shooting directly on Facebook. The video showed Philando dying in the driver's seat. It showed Yanez standing at the window, gun still drawn, voice shaking. It showed Reynolds being ordered out of the car at gunpoint, handcuffed, placed in the back of a police vehicle. It showed Diana being taken out of the car by an officer. The video was watched millions of times before Facebook temporarily took it down, citing graphic content. It went back up shortly after. President Barack Obama addressed the shooting the following day, saying incidents like this were not isolated and were symptomatic of broader racial disparities in the criminal justice system. Minnesota Governor Mark Dayton asked directly whether this would have happened if Philando and his passengers had been white. He said he did not think it would have. Yanez did not speak to investigators immediately after the shooting. He was placed on administrative leave, as is standard in officer-involved shootings in Minnesota. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension took over the investigation and spent several months reviewing the evidence, the video, the dashcam footage from Yanez's patrol car, and statements from witnesses. The dashcam footage from Yanez's vehicle was not released until after the criminal trial concluded. When it was finally made public, it showed the full sequence clearly. Yanez pulling over the car, the brief exchange, then the gunshots. Then Yanez standing at the window, gun drawn, yelling after he had already fired. His partner Causa, standing on the passenger side of the car, visibly jumped back when the shots were fired. In September 2016, the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension completed its investigation and handed its findings to the Ramsey County Attorney's Office. On November 16, 2016, Ramsey County Attorney John Choi announced that Yanez would be charged with 1 count of second-degree manslaughter and 2 counts of dangerous discharge of a firearm. Choi said at the press conference that Philando was not resisting and was not fleeing. He said Philando had voluntarily told the officer about the firearm beyond what the law required. He said there was simply no justification for the shooting. Yanez pleaded not guilty and was released without bail pending trial. The trial of Geronimo Yanez began in late May 2017 in Ramsey County District Court. It lasted about 3 weeks. Yanez testified in his own defense, telling the jury that he had smelled marijuana in the car, and that when Philando said he had a gun and appeared to be reaching, he believed he was in immediate danger. He said he feared for his life and for the life of his partner. The prosecution argued that the dashcam video, the physical evidence, and the testimony of use of force experts all showed that Yanez had no reasonable basis to fire. They pointed out that Philando had clearly communicated he was licensed to carry, that he was reaching for his identification as instructed, and that at no point had he made any threatening movement toward the officer. Use of force experts called by the prosecution testified that Yanez's decision to shoot was not consistent with proper police training and was not objectively reasonable given what was in front of him. The jury, which included 10 white jurors and 2 people of colour, deliberated for several days. On June 16, 2017, they returned a verdict of not guilty on all 3 counts. Yanez walked out of the courtroom a free man. The same day the verdict was announced, the city of St. Anthony released a statement saying Yanez had been fired from the police department. They said the public would be best served by him not returning to the force. He received a financial settlement from the city as part of his departure. There was no sentencing because there was no conviction. Philando Castile's mother, Valerie Castile, stood outside the courthouse after the verdict and said she was mad as hell. She called Yanez a murderer. She said the system continues to fail all black people. Diamond Reynolds, who had been handcuffed and put in the back of a police car after watching the man she loved be shot in front of her and her daughter, was never given an apology by the St. Anthony Police Department. She and Diana were held and questioned the night of the shooting. Reynolds said they were not fed, were not given information about Philando's condition, and were not released until early the next morning. The Ramsey County Attorney's Office reached a settlement with Philando's family. The exact amount of that settlement was reported as $3 million. The settlement was reached in 2017. The St. Anthony Police Department dissolved its patrol operations shortly after the shooting due to financial pressure and the public fallout from the case. The cities it had served contracted with other departments to provide police coverage going forward. Geronimo Yanez has not worked as a police officer since being fired in June 2017. He has not faced any further legal proceedings. He lives privately. Valerie Castile, Philando's mother, continued to speak publicly about her son in the years after the verdict. She appeared before congressional committees, spoke at rallies, and worked with community organizations focused on police accountability. She established the Philando Castile Relief Foundation, which has provided funding for free school lunches at J.J. Hill Montessori, the school where her son worked and where students still remember Mr. Phil. Philando Castile did everything right on the night of July 6, 2016. He was polite. He disclosed his firearm because the law said he should. He told the officer he was not reaching for it. He said it clearly, on camera, with his girlfriend and her child in the car. None of it saved him. He was shot 5 times and died at 32 years old on his way home from the grocery store. Quote, _2__. While Philando Castile was killed during a traffic stop on a public road, the next case happened somewhere that should have been the safest possible place in the world. Inside a woman's own apartment, in her own home, on a quiet Thursday night in Louisville, Kentucky, while she was asleep. Case 4. Breonna Taylor. Breonna Taylor was 26 years old. She worked as an emergency room technician at University of Louisville Health and was also working shifts at Norton Hospital. She was described by everyone who knew her as hard-working, compassionate, and full of life. She had been an honor roll student in high school. Her teachers remembered her as a natural leader. She had plans to enroll at Ivy Tech Community College in Indiana in the fall of 2020 to work toward becoming a neonatal nurse. On the night of March 12th into the early hours of March 13th, 2020, Breonna was at home in her Louisville, Kentucky apartment with her boyfriend, Kenneth Walker. They watched movies and went to bed. Just after midnight, 3 Louisville Metro Police Department officers forced their way through her front door using a battering ram. Within seconds, Breonna Taylor was shot 6 times. She died in her hallway. No drugs were found in her apartment. She had no criminal record. She was not the target of the investigation that brought those officers to her door. She was asleep in her own home. The officers were never charged with her death at the state level. One officer was eventually convicted on federal civil rights charges in 2024, 6 years after she was killed. The city of Louisville paid her family $12 million. Breonna Taylor was born on June 5, 1993, in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Her mother, Tamika Palmer, raised her and her younger sister, Janiah. The family moved to Louisville, Kentucky in 2008. Breonna attended Western High School, where she made the honor roll and was involved in school activities. Her teachers described her as driven and caring toward other people. After high school, she attended the University of Kentucky briefly before returning to Louisville and focusing on building her career. She worked her way up in healthcare, first as an emergency medical technician and later as an emergency room technician. By 2020, she was working as an essential worker during the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic, putting herself at risk to help patients every shift she worked. She had been in a relationship with Kenneth Walker, known as Kenny, for about 2 years by March 2020. Walker was a licensed gun owner with no violent criminal history. The two were living together in Breonna's apartment at 3003 Springfield Drive in Louisville's South End neighborhood. The Louisville Metro Police Department had been investigating a man named Jamarcus Glover, who was Breonna's ex-boyfriend and a convicted drug dealer. Investigators believed Glover was using Breonna's former address to receive packages related to drug trafficking. The investigation had also identified her current apartment as a location of interest, based on the claim that Glover had been seen visiting there and that Breonna had sent him money on one occasion. LMPD Detective Joshua Janes applied for a no-knock search warrant for Breonna's apartment. In the warrant application, he claimed that a postal inspector had verified that Glover was receiving packages at Breonna's address. That claim was false. A postal inspector later confirmed that no such verification had been made and that no suspicious packages had been going to her address. The warrant was built on a lie. A Jefferson County Circuit Court judge approved the warrant anyway. It was one of 5 warrants approved that night related to the Glover investigation. Jamarcus Glover was arrested at a different location the same night Breonna was killed. He was already in custody when the officers arrived at her door. Just after midnight on March 13, 2020, Sergeant Jonathan Mattingly, Detective Brett Hankerson, and Detective Miles Cosgrove arrived at Breonna's apartment. They were in plain clothes. They knocked on the door. Both Breonna and Kenneth Walker later said through Walker's account and witness statements that they heard banging, but did not hear anyone identify themselves as police. Walker said he thought someone was trying to break in. The officers then used a battering ram to force the door open. Walker, believing an intruder was entering the apartment, grabbed his legally owned handgun and fired one shot toward the doorway. That shot struck Sergeant Mattingly in the leg. The 3 officers returned fire. They fired a total of 32 shots into the apartment. Miles Cosgrove fired the shot that killed Breonna. Brett Hankerson fired 10 shots blindly through a covered window and glass door on the side of the apartment. Those shots went into a neighbouring apartment where a pregnant woman and a child were present. None of Hankerson's shots hit Breonna. Breonna Taylor was struck by 6 bullets. She fell in the hallway of her own apartment. No paramedics were called for over 20 minutes. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Kenneth Walker called 911 after the shooting. In the recording, he is heard saying somebody kicked in the door and shot his girlfriend. He did not know the people who had broken in were police officers. Police found no drugs in Breonna Taylor's apartment. They found no evidence of any drug trafficking. They found nothing that the warrant had claimed might be there. The entire justification for the raid was false from the beginning. Word of Breonna's death spread slowly at first. In the early weeks after March 13, 2020, Louisville was under COVID-19 restrictions and public gatherings were limited. Her family filed a wrongful death lawsuit in April 2020. Attorneys Ben Crump and Lanita Baker, representing the family, began making public statements about the circumstances of her death. As the country erupted in protests following the killing of George Floyd on May 25, 2020, Breonna's name became part of that same wave of national outrage. The hashtag #SayHerName spread across social media. Her image appeared on the covers of magazines. Athletes, celebrities, and politicians called for the officers to be arrested and charged. The Louisville Metro Police Department fired Brett Hankerson in June 2020. The The termination letter stated that he had blindly fired 10 shots into Breonna's apartment and into the neighbouring unit where a pregnant woman and child were present. It said his actions displayed an extreme indifference to human life. Miles Cosgrove and Jonathan Mattingly were placed on administrative reassignment but were not fired at that time. The Kentucky Attorney General Daniel Cameron took over the state criminal investigation. His office presented evidence to a grand jury in September 2020. On September 23, 2020, Cameron announced the grand jury's findings. Brett Hankison was indicted on 3 counts of wanton endangerment, not for killing Breonna, but for the shots he fired into the neighbouring apartment that could have killed the pregnant woman and child next door. No officer was charged with Breonna Taylor's death. The announcement caused immediate outrage. Protesters filled the streets of Louisville. 2 police officers were shot and wounded during the unrest that followed. Grand jury members later came forward publicly to say that Cameron had not presented the option of charging the officers with homicide-related offences related to Breonna's death. Cameron disputed this. An audio recording of the grand jury proceedings was later released, which further fueled the controversy over how the case had been handled. In October 2020, Brett Hankison pleaded not guilty to the wanton endangerment charges. In March 2022, he went to trial on those charges and was acquitted by a jury. In September 2020, the city of Louisville reached a settlement with Breonna Taylor's family for $12 million. It was described as the largest settlement ever paid by the city of Louisville in a wrongful death case. As part of the settlement, the city also agreed to implement a series of police reforms, including requiring supervisors to review and approve search warrants before they are submitted to a judge, and incentivizing officers to live in the neighborhoods they patrol. Louisville also passed an ordinance in June 2020, known as Breonna's Law, which bans no-knock warrants within the city limits. Governor Andy Beshear later signed Senate Bill 4 in April 2021, which restricted no-knock warrants statewide across Kentucky. The federal investigation into the case ran parallel to the state proceedings. In August 2022, the U.S. Department of Justice announced federal charges against 4 current and former Louisville police officers. The charges included civil rights violations, conspiracy, use of excessive force, and obstruction. Detective Joshua Janes and Detective Kelly Goodlett were charged with conspiracy for falsifying the warrant application that was used to justify the raid on Breonna's apartment. Goodlett pleaded guilty to conspiracy charges and cooperated with federal prosecutors. She admitted that she and Janes had knowingly included false information in the warrant. Brett Hankison was charged with federal civil rights violations for firing his 10 shots blindly into the apartment and the neighbouring unit. Kyle Meany, a sergeant who had approved the warrant, was also federally charged. In November 2024, a federal jury found Brett Hankison guilty of violating Breonna Taylor's civil rights through the unconstitutional use of excessive force. He was convicted on the federal charges, making him the first officer directly connected to Breonna's death to be found guilty of anything related to it. On July 21, 2025, Hankison was sentenced to 33 months in prison, which is 2 years and 9 months, followed by 3 years of supervised release. The Department of Justice had actually requested no prison time for Hankison, but the judge disagreed and handed down the sentence. Hankison's attorneys have indicated plans to appeal. Miles Cosgrove, the officer who fired the bullet that killed Breonna, was never charged with her death at either the state or federal level. He was eventually terminated from the Louisville Metro Police Department. Jonathan Mattingly, who was shot by Kenneth Walker and retired from the department and was never charged criminally. Kenneth Walker, the man who fired one shot believing his home was being invaded, was initially arrested and charged with attempted murder of a police officer. Those charges were eventually dropped. He has spoken publicly about the trauma of that night and about losing Breonna. Tamika Palmer, Breonna's mother, has spent the years since March 2020 speaking publicly about her daughter and demanding accountability. She was present at the signing of Breonna's Law. She has said repeatedly that no amount of money brings Breonna back, and that the reforms matter more than the settlement because they might save someone else's life. Breonna Taylor had plans. She was going to go back to school. She was going to become a neonatal nurse. She was an essential worker, keeping other people alive during a pandemic while her own city failed to protect her. She was shot 6 times in her own hallway at 12 years old by officers who had no legitimate reason to be there, operating on a warrant built on information that was never true. Brett Hankison is the only person who will serve prison time connected to her death. He will serve at most 33 months. Breonna Taylor was 26 years old. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While Breonna Taylor was killed by officers who forced their way into her home, the next case involves something even harder to process. An off-duty police officer who walked into the wrong apartment saw a man sitting on his own couch eating ice cream and shot him dead. And then a courtroom heard her say she thought it was her apartment 19 times during a single 911 call. Case 6. Oscar Grant. Oscar Julius Grant III was 22 years old. He lived in Hayward, California, a city in the San Francisco Bay Area. He worked in retail and had been employed at a butcher shop. He had a 5-year-old daughter named Tatiana, who he was raising with her mother. People who knew him described him as energetic, social, and deeply connected to his family and friends. His mother, Wanda Johnson, remembered him as someone who made everyone around him feel good. On the night of December 31st, 2008, Oscar went to San Francisco with a group of friends to celebrate New Year's Eve at the waterfront area near the Embarcadero. It was a normal night out. He was 22 years old, ringing in the new year with people he cared about. In the early hours of January 1st, 2009, Oscar and his friends boarded a Bay Area rapid transit train to head home. A fight broke out on the train, involving multiple passengers. BART police were called. When the train stopped at the Fruitvale BART station in Oakland, officers pulled Oscar and several of his friends off the train and onto the platform. What happened next was filmed by multiple passengers on their cell phones from inside the stopped train. Oscar Grant was face down on the platform. He was already pinned to the ground. He was not fighting. Officer Johannes Messerli drew his pistol and shot Oscar once in the back. The bullet passed through Oscar, ricocheted off the platform floor, and punctured his lung. Oscar was handcuffed after being shot. He was taken to Highland Hospital in Oakland, where he died 7 hours later. He was 22 years old. He had a daughter who was about to turn 6. He had gone out to celebrate New Year's Eve and never came home. Oscar Grant grew up in Hayward, California. He was close with his mother, Wanda Johnson, and his extended family. He had a daughter, Tatiana, born in 2003, and was actively involved in her life. By the time he was 22, he had been working in retail and the food industry, trying to build a stable life. His group of friends was tight. Many of them had grown up together in the East Bay. On the night he died, several of those friends were with him, including Jackie Bryson and Carlos Reyes, who were both on the platform when Oscar was shot. 2 of Oscar's closest friends, Chris Rafferty and John 2 Caldwell, who were also present that night, were later killed in separate, unrelated incidents in the years that followed. All 3 are buried next to each other. Wanda Johnson has spoken in interviews about suggesting that Oscar and his friends take the BART train home that night instead of driving, to avoid traffic and drunk drivers on New Year's. She has said in public statements that she has carried the weight of that suggestion ever since. On the night of December 31st, 2008, Oscar and his friends were on a crowded BART train returning from San Francisco to the East Bay. Somewhere along the route, a fight broke out involving multiple passengers in one of the cars. The train operator contacted BART police to report the disturbance. Officers were dispatched to respond. The train stopped at the Fruitvale BART station. BART officer Anthony Perrone was the first officer to arrive on the platform. He boarded the train and began pulling passengers he believed were involved in the fight off the train and onto the platform. Oscar Grant and several of his friends were among those removed. They were ordered to sit against the wall on the platform. What followed was captured on multiple cell phone cameras by passengers who remained on the stopped train, watching through the windows and doors. Perrone was aggressive from the start. The internal investigation report later commissioned by BART described his behaviour as the initiating factor in everything that followed. Perrone used profanity, used a racial slur toward Oscar, and struck Oscar in the head while forcing him against the wall. The report described Perrone's conduct as repeated, unreasonable, and unnecessary use of force from the moment he arrived. Within 7 minutes of Perone first arriving on the platform, Oscar Grant was dead. As multiple officers held Oscar and his friends on the platform, the situation became chaotic and tense. Perone forced Oscar face down onto the platform floor and pressed a knee into his neck and back, holding him down. Officer Johannes Messel arrived on the platform to assist. Messel attempted to handcuff Oscar, while Perone continued to restrain him from above. According to witness testimony and the cell phone footage, Oscar was complying at this point. He was not fighting. He was not trying to escape. He was on the ground, face down, with officers on top of him. Messel then stood up slightly, drew his pistol from his holster, and fired one shot into Oscar Grant's back at close range. The shot was audible in the footage. Passengers on the train reacted with screams. Oscar's friend Carlos Reyes, who was seated nearby on the platform and handcuffed, later told investigators he heard Messel say, "Oh shit, I shot him," immediately after firing. Messel was seen in the video raising his hands to his face after the shot. The bullet entered Oscar's back, passed through his body, struck the concrete platform floor, and fragments punctured his lung. Oscar was handcuffed after being shot. Officers at the scene called for medical assistance and backup, but did not initially broadcast over the radio that an officer was the shooter. An Oakland police officer who responded said she had to piece together on her own that it was an officer-involved shooting. Oscar Grant was taken by ambulance to Highland Hospital in Oakland. He died at 9:13 in the morning on January 1st, 2009. He was 22 years old. The cause of death was the gunshot wound to his back. The cell phone videos began appearing online within days of the shooting. They spread rapidly. Within a week, protests broke out in Oakland. On January 7th, 2009, approximately 500 people gathered peacefully at the Fruitvale station. By evening, some protesters had moved toward downtown Oakland, and the situation turned into riots. Windows were smashed and cars were burned. The anger was not just about Oscar Grant. It was about a pattern of police violence that the community had experienced for years, and the video had given that anger a specific, undeniable face. Messel resigned from BART Police on January 5, 2009, 2 days before the protests, and refused to speak to investigators, invoking his right against self-incrimination. He was arrested on January 13, 2009, in Zephyr Cove, Nevada, and extradited back to California. He posted $3 million bail on January 30th. At his trial, which was moved to Los Angeles County to ensure a fair jury, Messel testified that he had intended to draw his taser, not his firearm. He said he had panicked, confused the two weapons, and accidentally shot Oscar. His defense attorney argued this was a tragic mistake, not a crime. The prosecution argued that even if Messel had confused the weapons, drawing any weapon and firing it at a man who was already restrained and face down on the ground was an act of reckless disregard for human life. BART's own internal investigation report, which had been kept sealed for a decade before being released in 2019 under a California transparency law, directly undermined Messel's taser defense. The report noted that footage showed Messel trying to draw the weapon at least twice before successfully pulling it out, and on the final attempt, he was seen looking at his hand on the holster as the gun came out. The report concluded that deadly force was not justified under the circumstances. The report also noted that Messel had used force 6 times in 2008, more than any other officer on the platform that night, and more than most other BART officers that year. He had been with BART Police for just 2 years at the time of the shooting. A Los Angeles County jury found Messel guilty of involuntary manslaughter on July 8, 2010. He was acquitted of the more serious charges of second-degree murder and voluntary manslaughter. The verdict was announced while protests were already gathering in Oakland in anticipation of the decision. When the manslaughter verdict came down, many in the community felt it was inadequate. Riots broke out in Oakland again that evening. On November 5, 2010, Messel was sentenced to 2 years in prison. With credit for time already served and good behaviour allowances under California law, he was released from prison on June 13, 2011, having served approximately 11 months. Oscar Grant's mother, Wanda Johnson, delivered a victim impact statement at the sentencing. She described losing her son, the father of a young daughter, the child she had told to take the train home that night. She said the sentence did not reflect the value of her son's life. Oscar's daughter Tatiana was 6 years old when her father was shot. She was too young to fully understand what had happened. In the years that followed, Wanda Johnson raised public awareness about the case and about police accountability, ensuring Oscar's name was not forgotten. Bart settled a wrongful death civil lawsuit with Oscar's mother and daughter for a combined $2.8 million. Anthony Perrone, the officer whose conduct Bart's own internal report described as setting the entire chain of events in motion, was fired from Bart Police. He was never criminally charged. In October 2020, following the national protests after George Floyd's death, the Alameda County District Attorney announced she was reopening the investigation into whether Perrone could be charged. In January 2021, prosecutors announced they would not file charges against him, saying he did not personally kill Oscar and that the evidence did not support an aiding and abetting charge. Officer Marisol Domenici, who was one of the first officers on the scene and was later found to have lied during the internal investigation, was fired and then reinstated after an appeal. Johannes Messeler served 11 months in prison and was released in 2011. He has never publicly addressed the shooting in any significant way since his release. He has not worked as a police officer since his conviction. Oscar Grant's death became the subject of the 2013 film Fruitvale Station, directed by Ryan Coogler, with Michael B. Jordan playing Oscar in his final hours. The film was acclaimed internationally and introduced Oscar's story to a generation of people who had not been following the case in real time. It opened at the Sundance Film Festival and won the Grand Jury Prize and the Audience Award. In 2019, the intersection outside the Fruitvale BART station where Oscar died was rededicated in his honour. A mural bearing his name and image stands near the station. Wanda Johnson continues to speak publicly about her son and about the need for police accountability. Oscar Grant was face down on a train platform. He was already on the ground. He was already being held. He was not fighting. He was 22 years old with a daughter at home, and he was shot in the back. The officer who shot him served 11 months. The officer whose aggression started everything served nothing. While Oscar Grant was killed on a public train platform, surrounded by witnesses and cameras, the next case involves a woman who was alone in a dark alley in Minneapolis, who had done everything a responsible citizen is supposed to do, who had called the police because she was worried about someone else's safety, and who was shot dead the moment she approached the car to speak to the officers she had called. Case 7. Justine Damond. Justine Damond was 40 years old. She was originally from Sydney, Australia, and had grown up in the Northern Beaches area of New South Wales. She attended Manly High School and later graduated from the University of Sydney in 2002 with a degree in veterinary science. After working as a vet, she transitioned into life coaching and meditation instruction, work she described as her true calling. She was warm, spiritual, and deeply connected to the people around her. By 2017, Justine had been living in Minneapolis, Minnesota for several years. She had met an American man named Don Damond at a neuroscience workshop, and the two had fallen in love. They became engaged on December 29, 2014. Their wedding was planned for August 2017. Justine had already taken Don's last name professionally in anticipation of their marriage. She held dual Australian and American citizenship through her father. On the night of July 15, 2017, Justine called 911 because she was worried about someone in the alley behind her house. She thought she could hear sounds suggesting a woman was being sexually assaulted. She made 2 calls to report it. Then she went outside in her pajamas to meet the officers she had called, to help them, to make sure they found whoever needed help. Minneapolis police officer Mohammed Noor shot her once through the open driver's side window of the patrol car. She died in the alley behind her home. She was 40 years old, 5 weeks away from her wedding. Noor was convicted of third-degree murder and second-degree manslaughter in 2019. He was sentenced to 12.5 years in prison. His murder conviction was later overturned on appeal, and he was resentenced to approximately 5 years for manslaughter. The city of Minneapolis settled a wrongful death lawsuit with Justine's family for $20 million. Justine Damond grew up in a coastal suburb of Sydney in a loving family. Her father, John Ruschik, holds American citizenship, which allowed Justine to obtain dual citizenship. She was academically driven and completed her veterinary degree from the University of Sydney before eventually redirecting her professional life toward wellness and mindfulness work. She moved to the United States and eventually settled in Minneapolis with Don Damond, who had a son named Zach from a previous relationship. Justine embraced that role and became close with Zach, who was in his early 20s by 2017. Don later described Justine as someone who lived with her heart fully open, caring for others without reservation. By the summer of 2017, life was coming together for Justine in the way she had worked toward. The wedding was weeks away. She and Don had talked about starting a family. They had planned a vacation to Egypt in the fall of 2018, with hopes of conceiving a child on that trip. Her father and other family members were preparing to travel from Australia for the wedding. Everything she had built pointed toward a future that was about to begin. On the evening of July 15, 2017, Justine was at home in the Fulton neighborhood of Minneapolis. At around 11:27 in the evening, she called 911. She told the dispatcher she could hear sounds coming from the alley behind her house that made her think a woman might be in trouble. She described it carefully, saying she was not sure if it was someone having sex or being raped, but that she wanted police to check. She was trying to help someone else. She called 911 a second time, approximately 10 minutes later, to follow up. Officers Mohammed Noor and Matthew Harity were dispatched to the area in response to the calls. Noor, who was 31 years old at the time, had been with the Minneapolis Police Department for 21 months. He had been born in Somalia and had immigrated to the United States as a young child. He had been celebrated when he joined the force as one of the first Somali American officers in the Minneapolis Police Department, praised publicly by then Mayor Betsy Hodges and embraced by the local Somali community. Harity, his partner, had been on the force for approximately 1 year. Noor was in the passenger seat, Harity was driving. The two officers drove down the dark alley behind Justine's house in their patrol car, with the lights off, responding to the call about a possible assault. As they moved through the alley, Harity later testified he heard a loud bang on the side of the car and was startled. He said he feared an ambush, but did not reach for his weapon because he felt it was premature to use deadly force. Justine Damond approached the driver's side of the patrol car from outside. She appeared in the darkness near the window, in her pajamas. She was unarmed. She had nothing in her hands. Mohammed Noor, sitting in the passenger seat, reached across his partner and fired one shot through the open driver's side window. The bullet struck Justine in the abdomen. She collapsed in the alley. Harity got out of the car and went to her. He called for help over the radio. Noor did not fire any additional shots. Justine Damond died in the alley behind her home before paramedics could save her. Neither officer had activated their body cameras before the shooting. Both officers had been trained on the Minneapolis Police Department's body camera policy, which had been introduced in 2016. The cameras were on their uniforms. They were simply not turned on. There was no audio or video recording of the shooting itself. The only footage that existed was from the body cameras that were activated in the chaotic minutes after the shot was fired, showing the aftermath, not the moment. A 16-year-old on a bicycle happened to be nearby and filmed part of the scene on his phone after the shooting. The absence of body camera footage became a central issue in the public response to the case. The Minneapolis Police Department faced immediate questions about why the cameras were not activated. The shooting also prompted the resignation of Police Chief Janae Harteau, who stepped down in July 2017 at the request of Mayor Betsy Hodges, who said she had lost confidence in her leadership. News of Justine's death spread to Australia within hours. The Australian Prime Minister described the shooting as inexplicable. Her family in Sydney was devastated. Her father, John Ruschik, publicly called for answers, saying the world needed to understand how his daughter could call police for help and end up dead. Don Damond was away on a trip when Justine was shot. He received a phone call from investigators that night. He later said in his victim impact statement at sentencing that the phone call was so shocking and traumatic that he could not recall what he had said to Justine's family in Australia when he called them to deliver the news. Mohammed Noor initially refused to speak to investigators, invoking his right against self-incrimination. He retained a lawyer and declined to give a statement to the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, which is the state agency that investigates officer-involved shootings in Minnesota. He was placed on administrative leave and then fired from the Minneapolis Police Department after he was formally charged. In the months following the shooting, additional information emerged about Noor's history. In September 2018, it was reported that in 2015, during his training as a cadet officer, 2 psychiatrists and other training officers had raised concerns about his fitness for duty. A psychological evaluation had shown he disliked being around people and had difficulty confronting others. Despite those findings, a different evaluator had cleared him to proceed as a cadet. 2 months before the Justine Damon shooting, Noor had allegedly pointed his gun at the head of a driver he had pulled over for a minor traffic violation. He had 3 formal complaints against him at the time of the shooting, 2 of which were still pending resolution. The Hennepin County Attorney's Office charged Mohamed Noor with second-degree intentional murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter in March 2018. He pleaded not guilty. The trial began in April 2019. Noor testified in his own defense. He said that when Harity was startled by the noise near the car, Harity looked toward his gun and said, "Oh Jesus," which Noor interpreted as his partner being in fear for his life. Noor said he saw Justine appear suddenly from the darkness at the driver's side window and that he believed there was a threat to himself and his partner. He said he made a split-second decision to fire. Prosecutors presented evidence that directly contradicted key parts of this account. Forensic analysis showed that Justine's fingerprints were not found on the patrol car, meaning the claim that she had slapped or struck the vehicle before being shot could not be confirmed by physical evidence. 2 use-of-force experts called by the prosecution both testified that Noor's decision to fire was unreasonable and inconsistent with proper police training. Harity himself testified that while he had been startled, he had not reached for his weapon because he did not believe deadly force was justified. The prosecution also pointed out that Noor had fired across his partner, through the open window on the driver's side, in the direction his partner was sitting. Harity was directly in the line of fire between Noor and Justine. Prosecutors called this reckless in the extreme. On April 30th, 2019, the jury found Mohamed Noor guilty of third-degree murder and second-degree manslaughter. He was acquitted of the top charge of second-degree intentional murder. On June 7, 2019, Judge Catherine Quaintance sentenced Noor to 12.5 years in prison. The judge acknowledged that the act may have been based on a miscalculation, but said it was nonetheless an intentional act. She said, "Good people sometimes do bad things." Noor addressed the court before sentencing and said he caused the tragedy and that it was his burden. He said he would think about Justine and her family forever. 3 days after the conviction, the city of Minneapolis announced it had settled the wrongful death lawsuit filed by Justine's family for $20 million. The settlement was one of the largest in Minneapolis history for a case of this kind. Justine's family pledged $2 million of the settlement to a local charity focused on gun violence prevention in Minneapolis. Noor appealed his third-degree murder conviction. In 2021, the Minnesota Supreme Court overturned the third-degree murder conviction, ruling that the legal standard applied did not fit the circumstances of the case. He was resentenced in 2021 to approximately 4 years and 9 months on the manslaughter conviction. He was released from prison on parole in 2022. Justine's father, John Ruszczyk, said after the original sentencing that he was satisfied the jury had recognized the rule of law and the obligation of police to serve and protect. But he also said he remained deeply concerned about the Minneapolis Police Department as an institution, a concern that proved warranted 3 years later, when George Floyd was killed by a Minneapolis officer in May 2020. Don Demond has spoken publicly about the years of grief following Justine's death. He described her as someone who lived with her heart open and whose natural instinct was to help others, which is exactly what she was trying to do on the night she died. Justine Demond called the police because she was worried about a stranger. She went outside in her pajamas to help guide officers to whoever needed them. She was unarmed. She was 5 weeks from her wedding. She was shot dead through the window of a police car by an officer who had already raised concerns with his superiors and who had not turned his body camera on. Mohamed Noor served roughly 3 years in prison for killing her. He is now free. While Justine Demond was killed in a dark alley with no witnesses and no body camera footage, the next case was captured in horrifying detail on a police body camera inside a hotel hallway in Arizona, where a man lay on the floor sobbing and begging officers not to shoot him, saying, "Please don't shoot me," and was shot 5 times anyway while crawling toward them on his hands and knees. Case 8. Daniel Shaver. Daniel Leighton Shaver was 26 years old. He was from Granbury, Texas, a small city southwest of Fort Worth. He worked as a pest control specialist for a company that sent him on business trips across the country to exterminate birds from the inside of grocery stores and other commercial buildings. He used pellet guns in his work, air-powered rifles that fired small projectiles, to scare or eliminate birds that had gotten inside large retail spaces. It was an unusual job, but a legitimate one. He was a husband and a father. His wife, Lainey Sweet, was at home in Granbury with their 2 young daughters, while Daniel travelled for work. He was a family man, doing a job that required him to be on the road regularly. He was 26 years old. In January 2016, Daniel was in Mesa, Arizona on a business trip. He was staying at a La Quinta Inn and Suites on East Superstition Springs Boulevard. On the evening of January 18, 2016, he invited 2 acquaintances, a woman named Monique Portillo and a man named Luis Nunez, to his hotel room for drinks. At some point during the evening, he showed them the pellet rifle he used for work. At one point, the gun was visible near or pointed toward the 5th floor window of his room. A witness at the hotel saw this from outside and contacted the front desk. Hotel staff called the police. 6 Mesa police officers responded. They positioned themselves in the hallway outside Daniel's room. What followed was captured on the body camera worn by Officer Philip Brailsford. That footage, which was not released to the public until December 2017, after Brailsford's acquittal, showed one of the most disturbing sequences of events ever captured on police body camera in the United States. Daniel Shaver crawled down that hallway on his hands and knees, sobbing, begging the officers not to shoot him. He said, "Please don't shoot me." He was shot 5 times and died almost instantly. He was unarmed. The pellet guns were in his hotel room the entire time. He never touched them after stepping into the hallway. He was 26 years old, on a work trip, away from his wife and 2 daughters. Daniel Shaver was born on December 29, 1989, in Nashville, Tennessee. He grew up there and attended Hillwood High School, graduating in 2007. He eventually settled in Granbury, Texas, where he built a life with his wife, Lainey. They had 2 daughters together. By 2016, the girls were young children, and Daniel was working to support the family through his pest control career. His job required travel. Companies hired his firm to deal with bird infestations inside large commercial buildings, particularly grocery stores and warehouses. Birds getting into these spaces was a health code problem, and pest control specialists like Daniel were brought in to remove them. The pellet guns he carried were tools of that trade, not weapons in any conventional sense. He was in Mesa in January 2016 specifically for work. He was staying at the La Quinta Inn, a standard roadside hotel chain. He was not in trouble. He was not wanted for anything. He had no criminal history that would suggest he was a threat to anyone. On the evening of January 18, 2016, Daniel was in his room on the 5th floor with Monique Portillo and Luis Nunez. The 3 of them had been drinking. At some point, he showed his companions the scoped air rifle he used for work. A witness outside the hotel spotted the rifle near the window and reported it to hotel staff, who called 911. Luis Nunez left the room shortly before police arrived. 6 officers from the Mesa Police Department responded to the call and took positions in the hallway outside room 502. The team was led by Sergeant Charles Langley. Officer Philip Brailsford was one of the officers present, armed with an AR-15 rifle. All officers had their weapons drawn and trained on the door. The officers called out to the occupants to exit the room but received no response. Portillo later testified that she and Daniel had not heard the initial commands. Police then called the room's telephone and ordered the occupants to step outside. Daniel and Portillo came out of the room and into the hallway. What happened over the next several minutes in that hallway is documented in full on Brailsford's body camera footage. Sergeant Langley began issuing commands to Daniel and Portillo the moment they stepped into the hallway. Both were ordered to get on the floor immediately. They complied. Both lay face down on the hallway carpet with multiple officers pointing rifles at them from down the corridor. Langley's commands were not standard. They were confusing, contradictory, and at times physically impossible to follow smoothly, particularly for someone who had been drinking and who was terrified. Langley told Daniel to cross his left foot over his right foot while keeping his hands on his head, then to push himself up into a kneeling position without uncrossing his legs. He barked these instructions rapidly and with extreme aggression. During all of this, Langley told Daniel and Portillo explicitly that if they made a mistake, there was a very severe possibility they were both going to get shot. He told them to listen and obey. He told them he was not there to be tactical and diplomatic. Portillo was told to crawl toward the officers. She did. She was taken into custody without incident. Then it was Daniel's turn. Langley ordered Daniel, who was still lying on the floor, to cross his legs and push himself up to a kneeling position. As Daniel tried to comply, his legs came uncrossed slightly during the motion. Langley screamed at him. Daniel, visibly terrified and confused, put his hands near his waist momentarily, in an instinctive response to being screamed at. Langley shouted that if Daniel did that again, they were going to shoot him. Daniel said, "Please don't shoot me." He was sobbing. His voice was breaking apart. He said he was sorry. He put his hands back in the air. Langley then told Daniel to crawl toward the officers on his hands and knees. Daniel began crawling. The body camera footage shows him moving slowly forward down the hallway carpet, crying, hands and knees on the floor. As he crawled, his shorts, which were loose-fitting basketball shorts, began to slip down. He reached his right hand toward his waistband. The investigators who later reviewed the footage said this movement was consistent with someone pulling up sagging shorts. The detective who investigated the shooting agreed during the trial that it also looked similar to reaching for a waistband weapon, but specifically stated he did not see anything that would have prevented officers from simply walking forward and handcuffing Daniel while he was already on the floor. Philip Brailsford fired his AR-15 rifle. He shot Daniel 5 times. Daniel Shaver died almost immediately in the hallway of the La Quinta Inn. He was 26 years old. The pellet guns were in the hotel room behind him. He was completely unarmed. An autopsy report found that Daniel had been shot 5 times. 2 of the rounds entered the back of his neck and the back of his left shoulder. He had been shot from behind and from the side as he crawled away from, not toward, any officer in a threatening manner. The autopsy also confirmed Daniel had a blood alcohol level consistent with having consumed a significant amount of alcohol, which investigators said likely contributed to his difficulty following the rapidly delivered and contradictory commands he was given. The Mesa Police Department fired Philip Brailsford approximately 2 months after the shooting, citing violations of department policy. The termination letter identified multiple issues. One of the most striking was that Brailsford had engraved the phrase, "You're effed," on the dust cover of his personally owned AR-15 rifle, the same weapon he used to shoot Daniel Shaver. The dust cover was the part of the rifle that flips open when the weapon is fired. The engraving was accompanied by another phrase, "Molon Labe," a Greek expression associated with the American militia movement, meaning "come and take it." Brailsford had also previously been investigated for body slamming a teenager during an arrest. In March 2016, Maricopa County Attorney Bill Montgomery announced that his office had filed a direct criminal complaint charging Philip Brailsford with second-degree murder. The official statement from the county attorney's office said that after carefully reviewing the relevant facts and circumstances, they had determined that the use of deadly physical force was not justified. Brailsford pleaded not guilty. The trial of Philip Brailsford lasted approximately 6 weeks and concluded in December 2017. Brailsford testified in his own defence. He told the jury he was terrified for the safety of himself and the other officers. He said Daniel's movement toward his waistband had made him believe Daniel was reaching for a concealed handgun. He said if placed in the same situation again, he would make the same decision. The prosecution presented expert testimony, arguing that multiple tactical options were available to the officers that would not have required shooting Daniel. The investigator who reviewed the case testified that nothing he saw in the footage would have prevented officers from simply moving forward and handcuffing Daniel while he was already on the ground and crawling. There was no gun. There had never been a gun on Daniel's person. Sergeant Charles Langley, who had issued the chaotic and threatening series of commands that preceded the shooting, had retired from the Mesa Police Department and moved to the Philippines before the trial began. He was brought back to testify. His testimony was described by observers as notable for the lack of remorse he displayed. On December 7, 2017, the jury found Philip Brailsford not guilty of second-degree murder and not guilty of reckless manslaughter. He was acquitted on all charges. The verdict provoked widespread outrage. Former military personnel and law enforcement trainers publicly criticised both the tactics used in the hallway and the acquittal. David French, writing in National Review, said he had seen soldiers deal with Al-Qaeda terrorists with more professionalism and poise than what was shown in that hotel hallway. A former FBI tactical operations specialist wrote in CNN that the shooting was entirely preventable and that the commands issued by Langley directly contributed to Daniel's death. In a development that compounded the outrage, it was later revealed that the Mesa Police Department had temporarily rehired Brailsford after his acquittal. The rehiring was for a brief period, specifically to allow him to qualify for a medical pension based on a post-traumatic stress disorder claim related to the shooting. He received the pension and was then let go again. Lainey Sweet, Daniel's widow, fought for years for accountability. She described the acquittal as a sham criminal trial and said the failure of the criminal justice system to hold anyone responsible cast an irredeemable shadow over everything that followed. In November 2022, the city of Mesa reached an $8 million settlement with Lainey Sweet and Daniel's children. It was reported as the largest settlement ever paid by Arizona for the killing of a civilian by a police officer, and more than twice the highest settlement Mesa had previously paid in any case. The settlement included an arrangement for a tree and bench to be placed in Mesa's countryside park in Daniel's memory. Daniel's parents also settled a separate lawsuit with the city for $1.5 million. Philip Brailsford has not worked as a police officer since his termination from Mesa. He has not faced any further criminal proceedings. He receives a medical pension from the city of Mesa. Daniel Shaver was 26 years old. He was on a work trip. He was not armed. He did everything the officers told him to do, even when those instructions were contradictory, and screamed at him in a hotel hallway while he sobbed and begged for his life. The last words he spoke before being shot were, "Please don't shoot me." He had 2 daughters at home in Granbury, Texas, who were waiting for their father to come back from his business trip. They grew up without him. They are now teenagers. His wife raised them alone. While Daniel Shaver begged for his life in a hotel hallway and was shot for it anyway, the next case involves a young man who was doing nothing more than walking home from a convenience store, listening to music, wearing a ski mask because he was cold, and was stopped by police for looking sketchy, pinned to the ground, injected with a powerful sedative by paramedics without any proper medical assessment, and died 6 days later, having never done a single thing wrong in his entire life. Case 9. Elijah McClain. Elijah Jovan McClain was 23 years old. He lived in Aurora, Colorado, a suburb east of Denver. He worked as a massage therapist and had been practicing for about 4 years. He shared an apartment with his cousin near the area where he was killed. He was slight in build, weighing around 140 pounds. People who knew Elijah described him in ways that are hard to read without feeling the full weight of what was lost. He was a vegetarian. He did not eat meat and said he did not even kill flies. He played violin and would go to a local animal shelter on his days off to play music for the cats there because he believed it calmed them. He had never been arrested. He had never been charged with a crime. He was described by family and friends as the sweetest, most gentle person they had ever known, a pacifist and a peacemaker who was deeply spiritual and kind to everyone around him. He wore a ski mask when he walked outside because he had anemia, a condition that made him feel cold even in mild weather. He also suffered from social anxiety. He sometimes danced and moved to music as he walked down the street, a habit people who loved him found endearing. On the night of August 24, 2019, Elijah walked to a convenience store near his apartment to buy an iced tea. He paid for it and walked home. On the way back, a 17-year-old called 911 and reported a suspicious person wearing a ski mask and waving his hands. The caller said the person seemed sketchy, but acknowledged he was not sure if the person was doing anything wrong. 3 Aurora police officers stopped Elijah on the sidewalk. They put him in a chokehold. They forced him to the ground. Paramedics arrived and injected him with 500 milligrams of ketamine to sedate him. Elijah went into cardiac arrest on the way to the hospital. He was taken off life support 6 days later, on August 30th, 2019. His family said he was brain dead and covered in bruises. He was 23 years old. He had done nothing wrong. He had bought an iced tea and was walking home. Elijah McClain was born on February 25, 1996, in Denver, Colorado. His mother, Shanine McClain, moved the family from Denver to Aurora specifically to get away from gang violence and give her children a safer, more stable environment. Elijah grew up in Aurora and pursued a path in wellness and healing, training as a massage therapist and building a small client base through genuine skill and care. He was deeply introverted and described by everyone who knew him as someone who moved through the world differently from most people. He was passionate about music. He played violin and guitar. The work he did at the animal shelter, playing violin for cats and kittens, was entirely voluntary. Nobody asked him to do it. He went because he wanted to. He was not part of any gang. He had no history of violence. He had no criminal record of any kind. The ski mask he wore was not a disguise or an attempt to hide his identity. It was a practical response to a medical condition. He wore it regularly when he went out in cooler weather, because his anemia left him feeling cold in temperatures that most people found perfectly comfortable. He had social anxiety, which meant that being approached suddenly and aggressively by strangers caused him visible distress. That detail matters enormously in understanding what happened when the police stopped him. On the evening of August 24, 2019, Elijah left his apartment and walked to a convenience store. He bought an iced tea. He began walking home. He was listening to music. He was moving to the rhythm as he walked, something he did often. He was wearing his ski mask. A 17-year-old at a nearby location called 911. The caller said there was a suspicious person wearing a ski mask and waving his arms. The caller specifically said he was not sure if the person was doing anything wrong or illegal. That uncertainty was not communicated clearly to the officers who were dispatched. Officers Nathan Woodyard, Jason Rosenblatt, and Randy Rodimer responded to the call. They located Elijah walking on the sidewalk. Body camera footage shows Officer Woodyard getting out of his patrol car, approaching Elijah from behind, and saying, "Stop right there, stop, stop. Then I have a right to stop you because you are being suspicious." He said this within seconds of getting out of the car. He had not introduced himself. He had not explained why he wanted to talk. He had not asked Elijah any questions. He placed his hand on Elijah's shoulder and turned him around. Elijah, who was startled and anxious, tried to keep walking. He said he was going home. He said he was an introvert and asked the officers to respect his boundaries. The officers escalated immediately. They told him to stop tensing up. Elijah told them he was not doing anything wrong. He said he was just trying to get home. He was not aggressive. He was not threatening anyone. But he was scared, and his anxiety and fear were being read by the officers as resistance. Within moments, all 3 officers were involved in physically restraining Elijah on the sidewalk. They moved him to a grassy area. Officer Woodyard applied a carotid hold, which is a technique that involves pressing on the sides of the neck to restrict blood flow to the brain. Elijah lost consciousness at least once during the struggle. He vomited multiple times. He told the officers repeatedly that he could not breathe. He begged them to let him go. He apologized. He explained himself. The body cameras on the officers came off during the struggle, but audio continued to record even after the video was lost. What was captured on that audio is devastating to listen to. Elijah said, "I am just different. I am just different. That is all." He said he was sorry. He said he did not have a gun and did not do fighting. He said, "Why were you attacking me?" He said, "I do not even kill flies. I do not eat meat. I am a vegetarian." He said, "I am so sorry." He said all of this while 3 officers held him handcuffed on the ground. One officer at some point threatened to get his police dog to bite Elijah. Aurora Fire Rescue paramedics Jeremy Cooper and Peter Chickanek arrived at the scene. Elijah was handcuffed and lying on the ground. The paramedics assessed him briefly. Their assessment lasted only a matter of seconds, without any detailed examination. They concluded based on that brief visual observation that Elijah was experiencing excited delirium, a controversial and disputed medical classification that has been used in numerous cases to justify the use of chemical sedation on people in police custody. Cichiniec ordered that Elijah be injected with ketamine. The dose administered was 500 milligrams. Based on Elijah's body weight of approximately 140 pounds, the dose given was significantly higher than the recommended amount for someone his size. Proper ketamine dosing for sedation is calculated based on the patient's weight. The paramedics had not weighed Elijah. They had not conducted any meaningful medical examination. They gave him a dose calculated for someone much larger than he was. Elijah went into cardiac arrest shortly after the ketamine was administered. He was loaded into an ambulance. His heart stopped on the way to the hospital. He arrived at the hospital in cardiac arrest. He was placed on life support. Doctors worked to stabilize him, but the damage was too severe. 6 days later, on August 30th, 2019, Elijah McClain was taken off life support. He was pronounced dead. His family said he was brain dead and covered in bruises when they saw him in the hospital. He was 23 years old. He had bought an iced tea. He had been walking home. The initial response from Aurora authorities was to clear everyone involved of wrongdoing. The district attorney at the time, Dave Young, reviewed the case in late 2019 and declined to file charges. He cited the undetermined cause of death from the initial autopsy as a key factor, saying it was improbable that a prosecution could prove cause of death beyond a reasonable doubt. The initial autopsy listed Elijah's cause of death as undetermined. The case received little national attention in 2019. It was the wave of protests that followed George Floyd's death in May 2020 that brought Elijah McClain's story to a massive audience. People began sharing his words from the body camera audio, his descriptions of himself. "I am just different. I do not eat meat. I do not even kill flies," travelled across social media and hit people with extraordinary force. Hundreds of thousands of people signed petitions demanding the case be reopened. In June 2020, Colorado Governor Jared Polis ordered Attorney General Phil Weiser to open a new criminal investigation into Elijah's death. That same month, photographs emerged that had been taken in October 2019 by 3 Aurora police officers at the site where Elijah had been restrained. The photos showed the officers posing and reenacting the carotid hold that had been used on him, laughing. All 3 officers in the photos were fired. In September 2022, an amended autopsy report was released following the grand jury investigation. The updated report listed the cause of death as complications of ketamine administration following forcible restraint. The manner of death remained listed as undetermined rather than homicide, but the cause was now directly tied to what the officers and paramedics had done. In September 2021, Colorado Attorney General Phil Weiser announced that a state grand jury had indicted all 5 first responders involved. Officers Nathan Woodyard, Randy Rodemer, and former officer Jason Rosenblatt were each charged with manslaughter and criminally negligent homicide. Paramedics Jeremy Cooper and Peter Cichiniec were each charged with manslaughter, criminally negligent homicide, and assault related to the unlawful administration of drugs. The trials took place across 2023. In October 2023, Officer Randy Rodemer was convicted of criminally negligent homicide and third-degree assault. He was the only police officer convicted in connection with Elijah's death. He was sentenced in January 2024 to 14 months of work release, meaning he served his sentence outside of a traditional prison facility. He was not sentenced to prison time. Officer Jason Rosenblatt had been fired earlier for responding, "Ha-ha," to a text message containing one of the photos taken at the memorial site. He was acquitted of all charges at his trial. Officer Nathan Woodyard, the first officer to approach Elijah and the one who applied the carotid hold, was acquitted of all charges in November 2023. In December 2023, both paramedics were convicted of criminally negligent homicide. Peter Cichiniec was also convicted of second-degree assault for the unlawful administration of drugs. In March 2024, Cichiniec was initially sentenced to the mandatory minimum of 5 years in prison, but that sentence was later reduced to 4 years of probation. Jeremy Cooper was sentenced to 4 years of probation. Nobody involved in the death of Elijah McClain went to prison. In 2021, the city of Aurora settled a civil rights lawsuit brought by Elijah's family for $15 million. An independent panel commissioned by the Aurora City Council released a report in February 2021 that was unsparing in its conclusions. The panel found that Aurora police had no legal justification to stop Elijah in the first place. None of the officers had articulated any crime they believed Elijah had committed, was committing, or was about to commit. The panel found that the paramedics had sedated Elijah without conducting anything more than a brief visual observation, in direct violation of proper medical protocols. The report described a cascade of failures at every level, from the initial stop to the chemical sedation, each one building on the last. Shaneen McLean, Elijah's mother, has spoken publicly about her son in the years since his death. She has said that the police murdered her son and that the justice system allowed them to continue. She has said she will never stop fighting for him. Elijah's words from the body camera audio have been printed on signs and spoken at vigils around the world. "I am just different, that is all." Those words, said by a young man in the final minutes before he lost consciousness for the last time, have become one of the most recognised phrases associated with the movement against police violence. Elijah McLean went to a store, bought an iced tea, and walked home. He was stopped because a teenager thought he looked sketchy. He died 6 days later. The people responsible received probation, work release, and acquittals. The city paid his family $15 million and admitted no wrongdoing. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While Elijah McLean was killed on a quiet residential street in a Denver suburb, during what should have been a completely unremarkable walk home, the final case in this video takes us to New York City in 2006, where a 23-year-old man was shot 50 times by police officers on the morning of his wedding day, while leaving his own bachelor party with his father and his friends, and not a single officer ever spent a day in prison for it. Case 10. Sean Bell. Sean Elijah Bell was 23 years old. He was born on May 18, 1983, in Queens, New York, to William and Valerie Bell. He grew up in the Jamaica neighborhood of Queens, one of the most densely populated urban communities in the United States. As a child, he was interested in acting and played baseball. People who knew him growing up remembered him as outgoing, social, and full of energy. By his early 20s, Sean had built a life that was on the verge of something permanent and good. He had a fiancée named Nicole Poltra, who he had been with for years. Together they had 2 daughters. The older one was named Jada, the younger one was named Jordan, and was just 1 year old in November 2006. Sean and Nicole were days away from getting married. Their wedding was scheduled for November 25, 2006. The invitations had gone out, the plans were made, the day was coming. On the night of November 24, 2006, Sean went to his bachelor party at a club in Queens called Club Kahlua on Liverpool Street in Jamaica. He went with close friends and family members, including his father. It was the last night of his life as an unmarried man. He was 23 years old, about to become a husband, already a father, with everything in front of him. In the early hours of November 25, 2006, the morning of his wedding day, Sean Bell was shot 50 times by New York City police officers outside that club. He died from his wounds. He was 23 years old. He never made it to his wedding. His daughters grew up without their father. 5 officers fired those 50 shots. None of the 3 who were charged were ever convicted. Not one officer served a single day in prison for the death of Sean Bell. Sean Bell grew up in Jamaica, Queens, in a working-class neighborhood. His family was close. He was raised by his parents William and Valerie and grew up with a strong sense of community around him. He attended school in Queens and developed a wide circle of friends, many of whom remained in his life into adulthood. He had aspirations. His fiancée Nicole later described him in interviews as someone who had his mind set on becoming an electrician and building a trade career. He was not wealthy, but he was working towards something. He had a family. He had a future wedding. He had 2 daughters who needed their father. Nicole Poltra had been with Sean for years by 2006. Their relationship had produced 2 daughters and a deep bond. After Sean's death, Nicole legally changed her name to Nicole Poltra Bell in his memory, a decision that said everything about how she chose to carry him forward. The neighbourhood Sean grew up in and the circles he moved in were not without hardship. But Sean himself had no history of violence. He was not a gang member. He was not a drug dealer. He was a young father who was days away from making his relationship with Nicole official in front of the people they loved. Club Kahlua on Liverpool Street in Jamaica, Queens, was the location of Sean's bachelor party on the night of November 24th into the early hours of November 25th, 2006. The club had been the subject of complaints from the community about noise and activity, and it was also under surveillance by an NYPD undercover unit that was investigating allegations of prostitution and drug activity connected to the venue. That night, plainclothes and undercover NYPD officers were stationed in and around the club. Two of those officers, Detective Jescard Isnora and Detective Hispolito Sanchez, were inside the club posing as patrons. Several other officers, including Detective Michael Oliver, were stationed outside in unmarked vehicles. As the club was closing around 4 a.m, a confrontation developed. Isnora and Sanchez later testified that they observed an interaction between Sean's friend Joseph Guzman and another man outside the club that they interpreted as a potential threat. They said they heard Guzman make a statement they took to mean he was going to get a gun. The other man involved in the argument was never identified or located. No gun was ever found on Sean, Guzman, or their companion Trent Benefield. Isnora, believing he had witnessed the prelude to an armed confrontation, emerged from his undercover role. He radioed his supervisor, telling him it was getting hot. He followed Sean, Guzman, and Benefield as the three men walked around the corner and got into Sean's car, a white Nissan Altima. Sean was in the driver's seat, Guzman was in the front passenger seat, Benefield was in the back. Isnora approached the car on foot with his weapon drawn. Other officers converged on the scene. Detective Oliver drove an unmarked police van into the area. According to the officers, they identified themselves as police and ordered the men to stop. Guzman and Benefield later testified that they never heard anyone identify themselves as police and believed the armed men surrounding their car were attempting a carjacking or a robbery. Sean Bell drove the car forward. The car struck Isnora, who later said it hit him in the leg, and then struck the unmarked police van driven by Oliver. Isnora opened fire. He fired 11 shots at the car. Oliver then opened fire with his 9mm handgun and emptied 2 full magazines, pausing to reload, firing 31 shots. Other officers joined in. By the time the shooting stopped, 5 officers had fired a total of 50 bullets at a car containing 3 unarmed men. Sean Bell was struck multiple times in the neck and arm. He was killed. His car came to a stop against the police van. Guzman was struck by 11 bullets and was left in critical condition. Benefield was struck by 3 bullets and was in stable condition. Both survived. No firearm was ever found in the car or on any of the 3 men. Sean Bell died on the morning of his wedding day, November 25th, 2006. He was 23 years old. His daughters were waiting. Nicole was waiting. His parents were waiting. His guests were waiting. He never arrived. The shooting became public within hours and spread rapidly through New York City. The details were almost impossible to process. A man shot 50 times. On his wedding day, leaving his bachelor party, with no gun found anywhere near him or his companions. The Reverend Al Sharpton became a central public voice calling for justice. He held press conferences alongside Sean's family and the 2 survivors. He called the shooting an assassination and demanded that the officers be held criminally accountable. Community anger was intense, but the protests in the days following the shooting were significantly smaller than those that had followed previous high-profile NYPD shootings, partly because there was no viral video, no footage of the event itself. The shooting had happened in a dark street in the early morning and had not been recorded. The NYPD placed the involved officers on desk duty while an investigation was opened. The case was reviewed by the Queens County District Attorney's Office. The investigation lasted months. In March 2007, a Queens drug dealer who had been arrested on separate charges alleged, according to police sources, that Sean had shot him the previous year in a drug turf dispute. Sean's family and their attorney, as well as the 2 survivors, strongly denied this claim. NYPD Internal Affairs said the allegation had no direct bearing on the police shooting. The claim was widely seen by Sean's supporters as an attempt to damage his character and shift blame toward the victim. On March 16, 2007, a grand jury indicted 3 of the 5 officers who had fired shots. Detective Gesgard Isnora, who fired the first 11 shots, was charged with first-degree and second-degree manslaughter, second-degree reckless endangerment, and first-degree and second-degree assault. Detective Michael Oliver, who fired 31 of the 50 shots, including pausing to reload before continuing to fire, was charged with the same counts as Isnora. Detective Mark Cooper, who fired 4 shots, was charged with reckless endangerment. Officers Paul Headley and Michael Carey, who fired 1 and 3 shots respectively, were not charged. The defendants chose to have their case heard by a judge rather than a jury, a decision known as a bench trial. Justice Arthur Cooperman presided over the trial in Queens County Supreme Court. The trial ran for several weeks in early 2008. Isnora testified that he had genuinely believed one of the men in the car was armed and that the car driving toward him had put his life in danger. He said he had identified himself as a police officer before firing. He said he had no regrets and that every step he had taken that night was correct in the moment. Oliver testified through the framing that he had been responding to what he perceived as an active shooting situation. His attorney argued during the trial that Oliver could have fired 31 shots in as little as 12 seconds, presenting a demonstration using an NYPD pistol, in an attempt to show the jury that the volume of fire did not necessarily indicate recklessness. Guzman and Benefield both testified for the prosecution. They said they had never heard anyone identify themselves as police. They said they believed they were being robbed or attacked. They said no one in the car had a gun or made any move to retrieve one. A key defense forensic expert named Alexander Jason testified about the physical evidence. He argued that ballistic analysis supported the officer's account of the sequence of events, and that certain wounds on Benefield were inconsistent with him being shot while running away, as Benefield had claimed. On April 25, 2008, Justice Cooperman delivered his verdict. He acquitted all 3 officers on all charges, not guilty on every single count. He said the prosecution had not proved beyond a reasonable doubt that the officers had acted with criminal intent or recklessness beyond what could be legally justified under the circumstances. Nicole Poultray Bell was in the courtroom. When the verdict was read, she walked out immediately. Outside, she addressed supporters and said that on April 25, 2008, they killed Sean all over again. She said the justice system had let her down. She said she had given it the benefit of the doubt, and it had failed her daughters, failed Sean. Reverend Al Sharpton organised protests in response to the verdict. Several hundred people were arrested during demonstrations in New York City in the days following the acquittal. The NYPD deployed large numbers of officers to manage the unrest. A federal civil rights investigation was opened by the United States Department of Justice following the acquittals to determine whether the officers had violated Sean Bell's constitutional rights. That investigation ran for years. Federal prosecutors ultimately declined to bring charges, following the same pattern seen in multiple other cases in this video, where federal prosecution did not follow state acquittals. The disciplinary process within the NYPD was the only remaining avenue for any consequence. Commissioner Ray Kelly oversaw that process. Isnora was found by an NYPD disciplinary tribunal to have violated department guidelines by emerging from his undercover role prematurely, before backup had arrived, and by firing into a vehicle containing unarmed men. He was fired. Oliver was also found to have violated department policy. He was fired as well. Cooper was also dismissed from the department through the disciplinary process. The firings came years after the shooting and after the acquittals. No criminal conviction accompanied them. Nicole Poultray Bell, along with Guzman and Benefield, filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the City of New York. In 2010, the city settled the lawsuit. The settlement paid approximately $3.25 million to Nicole and Sean's daughters, approximately $3 million to Joseph Guzman, and approximately $900,000 to Trent Benefield. The total settlement was just over $7 million. The city did not admit any wrongdoing. Isnora gave an interview to NBC New York in 2012 after being fired. He said he had no regrets. He said he could sleep at night. He said people making comments about the 50 shots did not understand the job that undercover officers do. He said Belen Guzman had set the events in motion. He said every step he took that night was correct. He said he did not learn until 2 days after the shooting from press coverage that none of the men in the car had a gun. He found out from the news 2 days later. Nicole Poulter Bell has never stopped speaking publicly about Sean. In November 2019, 13 years after his death, she released a statement saying the pain had not subsided and that she was still seeking answers from a justice system that had failed her daughters and taken away their father. She described the acquittals as reflecting negligence, assault, civil rights violations, and egregious misconduct that all pointed to guilt, and said she could not understand how the outcome had been what it was. The Sean Bell Community Centre was opened in Jamaica, Queens, in 2011 in his memory. It serves young people in the neighbourhood where Sean grew up. His name is on the building. His daughters grew up a few miles from where their father was shot. Jada and Jordan Bell grew up knowing their father only through stories, photographs, and the tireless advocacy of their mother. Jordan was 1 year old when Sean died. She has no memory of him. Jada was slightly older, but still too young to have held on to real recollections. They are now young adults. They grew up in a city that settled their father's wrongful death lawsuit for money and admitted nothing. Sean Bell was 23 years old. He was a father. He was a fiancé. He was hours away from becoming a husband. He had 2 daughters who needed him, and a woman who loved him, and a future that had been fully planned and was waiting to begin. 50 bullets. No gun found. No conviction. 3 officers fired from their jobs years after the fact. A settlement paid without any admission of guilt, and 2 little girls who grew up without their father because 5 police officers fired 50 rounds at a car full of unarmed men on a dark street in Queens at 4 in the morning. Sean Bell never made it to his wedding. Nicole Poulter Bell never got to walk down that aisle. Jada and Jordan Bell never got to grow up with their father in the house. The officers who fired those 50 shots went home, went through disciplinary proceedings, were eventually fired from their jobs, and lived their lives. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.